My name is Evie Clark. I'm 28 years old, and while I was 6,000 miles from home, coordinating supply lines in a Middle Eastern war zone, my father intercepted my dying grandmother's phone calls for 2 years, letting her die thinking I'd abandoned her, just so he could forge my signature and steal my $450,000 inheritance to fund my sister's vanity project. I was sitting on a creaky cot in a sweltering tent when the text arrived, showing my sister beaming in front of a brand new restaurant paid for with the liquidation of the Lake Norman property my grandmother had specifically deeded to me in her final days. My grandmother, Evelyn Clark, had been dead for months, leaving a void that no amount of military discipline could fill, and I realized then that my own family had executed a cold-blooded financial ambush while I was busy serving my country. Every dollar of that sale went straight into my sister's culinary vanity project, and as I stared at my phone in the dark, the silence of the desert night became heavy enough to suffocate. I remember thinking that morning that the hardest part of my deployment was already behind us. I honestly believed that my family was a sanctuary, not a crime scene. I need to ask you something first. Where are you listening from? Because what I'm about to tell you, I have never shared with anyone. The blue glow of the screen lit up the corrugated metal ceiling of the temporary barracks I shared with 3 other officers, the air conditioning unit rattling in a desperate, failing rhythm against the 110-degree heat outside. My sister's face smiled back at me from the photo, her hair perfectly blown out at some high-end Charlotte salon as if she didn't have a care in the world, and behind her, a reclaimed wooden sign read, "Evelyn's Table," in a trendy gold leaf script. She named it after our grandmother to sanitize the theft, using the money our grandmother left for my future as her own personal venture capital. And she sent me a smiley face emoji, as if this were all just some quirky family surprise. I didn't respond to that message. Not that night as the sandstorms began to howl against the reinforced canvas, and not for the next 3 months while I handled the grueling midnight briefings. My family thought my silence meant I'd accepted the loss, interpreting my professional composure as total submission, and they assumed that the distance and the weight of my work had made me too tired to fight back. They thought I'd come home, sit down at the Thanksgiving dinner table, and swallow their betrayal the way I'd swallowed every other bitter pill they'd fed me since I was a kid. They were wrong, because they mistook my professional composure for weakness, forgetting that the Army doesn't just teach you how to move cargo. It teaches you how to map out a situation and act with surgical precision. When I finally flew home to North Carolina, I didn't drive to my parents' manicured suburban house, and I didn't call to check in, but instead, I walked into a county courtroom with a heavy-duty folder full of evidence my father never saw coming. And what the judge said that afternoon made him collapse into his leather chair in front of everyone, his face turning the color of ash. Growing up in the Clark house, you learned the social hierarchy fast, and it was more rigid than any military chain of command I've ever followed. My father, Caleb Clark, a man who had spent 30 years as a senior VP of private wealth management, sat at the head of every table, literal and figurative, presiding over us like a king whose crown was a balanced ledger. He'd spent his career managing the wealth of the Charlotte elite, and he brought that same cold, calculated energy into our living room every single night. He kept the household budget on a complex spreadsheet that he reviewed with us like we were failing employees who were lucky to still have a desk. He approved every purchase over $50 with the scrutiny of a federal auditor, and when he talked, you didn't interrupt unless you wanted a lecture on fiscal responsibility and the value of a dollar. My mother, Elise Clark, held the second chair, acting as the loyal assistant who'd long ago traded her backbone for a quiet life in the suburbs. She hadn't worked a job since the mid-90s, and her only role was keeping the peace, which usually meant keeping us in line with whatever my father wanted. Her favorite phrase, delivered with a was always that my father knew best and that I shouldn't make waves. Then there was my sister, Harper Clark, the undisputed favorite in our family's high-stakes game of favoritism, who had bounced between 4 failed business attempts by the time she was 25. My father covered her luxury condo rent in the uptown area, while my mother defended her erratic choices over Starbucks and sympathy, because she was the daughter who stayed within the radius of my father's control. I was the other one, the one who joined ROTC during my time at UNC Charlotte to pay for a degree I knew they'd try to use to manipulate me. I remember the night I told my father at the dinner table that I'd accepted a commission in the Army and was heading to Fort Benning. He set his silver fork down with a against the china and looked at me like I'd insulted him in the middle of grace. He told me I'd regret it, that the military didn't care about me, and that I was just a number on a manifest to them, while my mother just pressed her linen napkin to her mouth to stifle a protest she'd never actually voice. Only one person drove me to the airport the day I shipped out, ignoring the tension that hung over the house like a storm cloud. My grandmother, Evelyn Clark, was 74 years old and barely 5'2", but she was steady as a rock behind the wheel of her old navy blue Buick LeSabre. She hugged me at the curb, smelling like peppermint and lavender, and she told me that her house would always be there for me and that I shouldn't let them dim my light. I didn't know that was the last summer I'd see that house with my name still on it, the last time I'd feel the cool breeze off Lake Norman before my world turned into a desert. I was 14 weeks into a logistics deployment when I found out she was gone. Not from a phone call to my satellite phone, but from an email from my mother that popped up amidst a sea of status reports. It was 4 sentences long, telling me the funeral was on Saturday and that it was best if I stayed focused on my mission. The woman who raised me every summer, who taught me how to balance a checkbook without a computer and stand up straight when men talked over me, was reduced to a footnote in an email sent at 3 a.m. my time. I went to my commanding officer that same morning, my face a mask of military bearing despite the roaring in my ears, and the Army showed more compassion than my own blood, approving emergency leave within hours. But when I called home to say I was catching a flight from Kuwait to Charlotte, my mother told me that everything was already planned and there was no point in disrupting the schedule. I heard my father's voice in the background, from a distant room. And then my mother told me that Grandma would have wanted me to focus on my duty to the flag. They didn't want me there, and the realization felt colder than the high-altitude air of a C-17 transport plane. I sat on the edge of my cot for a long time after that call, staring at my dusty combat boots and wondering how the people who raised me could be so hollow. Then, at 3 a.m. local time, I watched my grandmother's funeral on a pixelated live stream while huddled in the corner of a comms tent. The camera was propped on someone's lap, and it shook every time they breathed, making the whole scene feel like a dream I couldn't wake up from. My sister stood at the mahogany podium, wearing a designer dress that looked suspiciously new, and she dabbed her eyes with a tissue while reading a lie about how our grandmother loved all of us equally. I turned off my phone, the screen going black like a shutter closing, and I lay in the dark listening to the monotonous hum of the air unit bolted to the wall. At the time, I told myself my family was just being thoughtless, too caught up in their own grief to remember the granddaughter stationed in a desert. But I didn't realize yet that they needed me absent for their plan to work. The memory of Lake Norman was the only thing that kept me anchored during those long shifts in the Middle East, where the air smelled like burning trash and jet fuel instead of the sweet, heavy scent of pine trees and lake water. I used to close my eyes in the barracks and try to feel the way the humidity in North Carolina felt like a warm hug, a thick blanket of air that meant you were home and you were safe. I could see the weathered wooden dock where I'd spent every summer catching bluegills until my fingers were raw, and the way the sun would set over the water, turning everything a deep, bruised purple. That house wasn't just a piece of real estate assessed at $450,000. It was the only place where the Clark family hierarchy didn't seem to reach. When I was there with my grandmother, I wasn't the daughter who had failed my father's expectations or the sister who lived in a shadow. I was just a girl who knew how to tie a fishing knot and keep a secret. And I think most of us know that feeling, when you're holding on to a memory of a place so tight because it's the only thing that feels like yours in a world that's constantly trying to tell you who to be. My grandmother, Evelyn Clark, had a way of making the rest of the family feel like a distant radio station, something you could hear but didn't have to listen to. She'd sit on that wraparound porch in her old straw hat, sipping sweet tea and watching the boats go by, and she'd tell me that the world was a lot bigger than the four walls of my father's study. She taught me how to gut a fish with a dull pocket knife, how to balance a checkbook on the back of a grocery receipt, and how to look a man in the eye when he was trying to talk over you. She was the one who understood why I needed to join the Army, why I needed to find a chain of command that was based on merit rather than my father's bank balance. When I was deployed, I used to imagine her sitting in her navy blue Buick LeSabre, driving down to the diner to get a slice of cherry pie, and that image was my North Star. I didn't realize that while I was using those memories to survive, my father and my sister were using that same house as a pawn in a game I didn't even know we were playing. I remember one summer when I was 12, my grandmother and I spent the whole afternoon fixing the loose boards on the private dock. It was 95 degrees, and we were both covered in sweat and sawdust, but she wouldn't let me stop until every nail was flush. She told me then that if you don't take care of what's yours, someone else will decide it belongs to them. And I thought she was talking about the dock, but she was talking about my life. She was a retired librarian who spent her days reading legal thrillers and history books, and she had this way of seeing through people that used to terrify my father. He'd come down for the 4th of July, wearing his expensive polo shirts and acting like he was the CEO of the lake, and she'd just offer him a deviled egg and ask him if he'd finally learned how to change a tire. She knew he was a man who measured his worth in spreadsheets, and she knew that my sister Harper Clark was exactly the same, just with less discipline and a higher credit card limit. In the desert, I would look at the photos of the lake on my iPhone until the battery died, tracing the lines of the shoreline and the way the pine needles covered the dirt driveway. It was a breath of air, in a place where I felt like I was constantly suffocating under the weight of responsibility and the dry heat. I trusted my parents to handle the probate because that's what you do when you're 6,000 miles away. You trust the people who gave you your name to protect it. I thought about the house as a safety net, a place I could go when my service was over, a place where I could finally sit on that porch and feel the breeze without having to listen for the sound of a generator or a transport plane. I didn't know that my father had already walked into a bank in Charlotte with a forged document, or that my sister was already picking out granite countertops for a restaurant that was being built on the grave of my future. I spent my R&R time thinking about the Lake Norman house, imagining the way the water would feel on my skin after months of sand and dust. I even looked at curtains online, thinking about how I'd fix up the guest room for when my fellow officers came to visit. It was a quiet hope, something I kept to myself like a lucky charm. My grandmother had been the only person who ever told me I was enough, just as I was, without a promotion or a medal. And that house was her way of making sure I always had a place where that was true. I honestly believed that as long as those pine trees were standing, I had a home to go back to. I sat on my cot in the Middle East, surrounded by olive drab gear and military-grade plastic, and I felt rich because I had a legacy waiting for me in North Carolina. I was so focused on the mission, so focused on the chain of command, that I never looked over my shoulder to see the people I loved most holding the knife. The intuition that serves you on a base in a hostile territory, that prickle on the back of your neck when a convoy route feels too quiet, started buzzing about 2 weeks after the funeral. I received an email from my grandmother's estate attorney, a man named Philip Reed, who was a partner at a firm in Raleigh. I read it in the mess hall, surrounded by the metallic clatter of trays and the heavy, burnt smell of Starbucks coffee that had been sitting in the pot since 4 a.m. The PDF was the last will and testament of Evelyn Clark, and as I scrolled through the legal terms, my heart started to pound against my ribs. Her savings and jewelry, including her vintage pearls, were to be divided between my father and me, but the lake house, the prime 2-acre property with the wraparound porch, was left to one person: me. My throat tightened, the dry air suddenly feeling thick as I swallowed, and I read the document 3 times just to make sure I wasn't hallucinating from sleep deprivation. I stepped outside into the shimmering heat and called home, the sand crunching under my combat boots, and my father answered on the first ring with a voice as crisp as a new $100 bill. "Dad, I just got the will from Philip Reed," I said, my voice sounding thin and metallic over the satellite connection as I paced a small circle in the hot sand. "I can't believe Grandma left me the Lake Norman house. It feels like a dream." There was a silence on the other end of the line that lasted exactly 5 seconds. A silence that didn't mean he was thinking or grieving, but the kind of silence a senior VP of wealth management uses when a loan application is about to be denied. Then my father, Caleb Clark, spoke with a tone that shifted instantly from casual to the cold, controlled register he used when he was reading from a bank script. He told me that we needed to talk about the house, that it had been in the family for 30 years, and that Evelyn wasn't thinking clearly at the end because the dementia was setting in, even if she'd hidden it well from me. I told him she seemed clear every time we talked, that we'd even discussed the property taxes the previous July, but he cut me off with a sharp, impatient breath. He said I wasn't there, that I didn't know how she was when the sun went down, that she was confused and paranoid, and that we would discuss it when I came home and had time to cool off. Before I could respond, the line went dead, leaving me with nothing but the monotonous hum of the desert wind and a growing weight in my chest that felt like lead. I stood in the shimmering 115-degree heat for a long time, feeling the sun radiate off the sand dunes like a furnace, and I tried to tell myself that my father was just stressed by the probate process. I made the mistake that people who love their families always make. I assumed that even if he was being difficult, he wouldn't actually cross the line into a felony. 3 months passed as the deployment settled into the slog, where the days blurred into 14-hour shifts of managing supply chain disruptions and convoy schedules that changed every 48 hours. I emailed my father twice about the deed transfer, but I received no response. And when I called my mother, Elise Clark, she spoke quickly and nervously, telling me that Caleb had everything under control and that I should just focus on staying safe. She told me he was at the Home Depot or at the office every time I asked to speak with him, and he never called me back. Not that week, and not the next. I spent those 2 years thinking she was just tired, or that the overseas connection was too much for her to navigate. I'd send her postcards from the base, picturing her sitting at the kitchen table reading them with a smile, never once doubting that my father was passing along my love. I felt so secure in that silence, so certain that my distance was being bridged by the people I trusted most. The silence from North Carolina was beginning to feel like a conspiracy, and one night I woke up at 2 a.m. with my heart pounding, soaked in sweat in my green undershirt. The next day, during a break between fuel shipments, I called Clara Vance, my grandmother's neighbor and closest friend, a woman who had lived 2 doors down from the Lake Norman house for 20 years. Her southern drawl sounded like home, but her words were a jagged blade that cut through my composure when she told me she'd seen a realtor sign with a sold banner across the top of my grandmother's yard. My breath hitched in the comms tent, and then she said something that made the world stop turning. She told me how sorry she was that I hadn't called Evelyn back during those final years, because my grandmother had sat by that window every day, wondering why I'd forgotten her. I felt the air leave my lungs as Clara explained that my grandmother had called my father's house every week, begging him for my military number, and he had told her I was too busy with the army to talk to an old woman. You know what? Evie just stood there in the sand holding that phone, listening to the sound of a life being erased. You've been through things. You know what it feels like when family turns on you. What would you tell her right now? Drop it below, because what she did next surprised even me. I stood there in the sand, and for a second, I couldn't feel my hands as the reality of what he'd done settled into my bones. I was standing there thinking, he didn't just take the house. He took away our last 2 years. He let her die thinking I didn't care about her, just so he could keep his control over the narrative. I realized then that while I was counting MREs and spare parts in a war zone, my father was sitting in his mahogany-paneled study in Charlotte, intercepting the calls of a dying woman and letting the silence grow between us like a poison. It wasn't just greed. It was a cold-blooded tactical move to ensure that when she passed, there would be no one to question his authority or his version of the will. The betrayal felt like a physical weight, a pressure in my chest that made it hard to breathe, and I knew in that moment that I wasn't just a daughter anymore. I was a plaintiff who was about to go to war. I spent the next hour on the sluggish military network, my hands shaking so badly I mistyped the county assessor's website twice while sitting on the floor of the communications tent. When the page finally loaded for 1140 Lakeshore Drive, the owner of record was listed as transferred on a date when I was standing in a dusty warehouse outside Kuwait City. The seller was listed as Helena Clark, my name, used without my knowledge, via a power of attorney represented by Caleb H. Clark. I sat on that floor for a long time, the blue light of the laptop reflecting in my stinging eyes, and I realized that my father had used his 30 years of banking experience to forge my life away. He had used a legal document to commit a Class H felony, and he had done it while I was 6,000 miles away, serving a country that he claimed would treat me like a number. I called him one last time, my voice steady with the kind of cold fury they teach you in officer candidate school. And when he answered, he didn't even sound guilty. He told me that it was the right thing for the family, that my sister, Harper Clark, needed the capital for her restaurant, and that it was an investment for all of us. He spoke to me like I was a disgruntled customer at the bank, explaining that he'd made a decision for the family because I was too far away to see the big picture. When I told him he had forged my name and committed a crime, he just said, "That's what fathers do when their children are too far away to understand." I hung up the phone and something inside me changed shape, hardening into something cold, sharp, and immovable that would never again be broken by his voice. I was no longer the girl who needed his approval, or the soldier who believed in the sanctuary of home. I was a captain in the United States Army, and I was about to execute a tactical strike that would dismantle his financial empire piece by piece. The journey back to North Carolina was a blur of gray terminal seating, the smell of stale jet fuel, and the constant rhythmic thrum of C-17 engines that seemed to vibrate in my very teeth. I landed at Fayetteville Regional Airport on a Thursday afternoon, the humidity hitting me like a physical wall the moment I stepped out of the cabin, a thick, wet blanket of air that smelled of damp earth and pine. My deployment was officially over, but as I stood on the tarmac watching the baggage handlers move with a slow, southern, deliberate pace, I realized that the hardest mission of my career was just beginning. I didn't call my mother, Elise Clark, even though my phone was blowing up with texts about a pot roast dinner and how Caleb had already opened a bottle of expensive Cabernet to celebrate my return. I ignored the notifications, slung my heavy canvas duffel over my shoulder, and took a lift straight to my apartment near Fort Liberty. It was a small one-bedroom place I'd rented just before shipping out, a space that was supposed to be my own little corner of the world where the Clark family rules didn't apply. I unlocked the door, and the silence inside felt like a gift, a cool, quiet sanctuary that smelled of the lavender soap I'd left in the bathroom months ago. I stood there for a moment with my eyes closed, just breathing in the stillness and thinking that for the first time in 2 years, I was finally in a place where no one could reach me, and I could finally just be a person instead of a soldier. I walked through the small living room, noticing the way the afternoon sun hit the hardwood floors, and I felt a brief, flickering hope that maybe I could have one night of peace before I had to deal with the forgery and the theft. Then I heard the unmistakable sound of the refrigerator door closing in the kitchen. I rounded the corner and stopped dead, my military bearing the only thing keeping me from stumbling back. My father, Caleb Clark, was sitting on my small sofa with his legs crossed, looking as comfortable as if he were presiding over a wealth management seminar at the Charlotte Country Club. My mother was in the kitchen, busily unpacking Whole Foods grocery bags filled with artisanal cheeses and organic lemons, while my sister, Harper Clark, was leaning against my counter scrolling through her iPhone, her designer sunglasses pushed up into her hair. They had used the emergency key I gave my mother, a key intended for burst pipes or my own death, to stage a home invasion they were trying to dress up as a family reunion. I stood there thinking, even here, in the one place I pay for with my own salary, he has to show me that he owns the locks and the air I breathe. I felt a coldness settle in my chest that was sharper than any desert wind I'd faced in Jordan. I have to stop here for a second. Has someone ever taken something from you that wasn't theirs to take? You don't have to share the whole story. Just a heart below if you've been there. You are not alone. Because what happened next in that kitchen was the moment the bridge finally burned. The room shifted, the temperature seemingly dropping 10 degrees as they all looked up at me with smiles that didn't reach their eyes. My father called me soldier and told me it was time to put the past behind us, while Harper held up a white box of pastries from her stolen restaurant, telling me I had to try the lemon tarts she'd named after our grandmother. My mother rushed toward me with her arms open, her face already blotched with the kind of practiced tears she used to end every argument we'd ever had. I didn't move, my hands staying flat at my sides, and I asked them how they got in. My mother's voice was a high-pitched plea for normalcy as she reminded me about the emergency key, acting as if her daughter returning from a war zone was the same thing as a busted water main. I told them to leave, and the silence that followed was so heavy I could hear the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a lawnmower outside. My sister laughed, a sharp, brittle sound that echoed off the subway tile backsplash I'd picked out myself, and she told me not to be dramatic because it was just a dinner. She stood there in a silk blouse paid for by the liquidation of my inheritance, acting as if I was the one being unreasonable for wanting privacy in my own home. My father didn't move from the couch, instead doubling down on his authority by telling me that I was throwing away my family over a house. He spoke about Evelyn as if he were her authorized representative, rather than the man who had let her die in a silence he created. I looked at him, really looked at him, and realized that Caleb truly believed he was the victim because his daughter was finally refusing to follow the Clark script. I walked to the front door and opened it, letting the humid North Carolina evening air rush back into the room, and I told them again to get out. My mother flinched as if I'd struck her, and Harper grabbed her pastry box with a look of pure entitlement, muttering about how I was always so petty. But it was my father's reaction that stayed with me. He walked toward the door slowly, stopping so close I could smell the expensive aftershave and the faint, biting scent of the scotch he'd clearly had before coming over. He told me that if I did what he thought I was going to do, I wouldn't have a family to come back to. I met his eyes with the cold, tactical assessment of an officer, and I told Caleb that I hadn't had a family in a long time. When the door finally clicked shut and I turned the deadbolt, I didn't cry and I didn't shake. I walked to the kitchen, took the bag of organic lemons my mother had left on the counter, and threw them in the trash. Then I picked up my phone and called a locksmith to change every cylinder in the apartment. After that, I called Sophia Reed, the real estate litigation expert in Raleigh I'd been emailing from the Middle East. She picked up on the second ring, her voice as sharp and professional as a bayonet, and I told her it was time to file the complaint. I told her I wanted everything: the forgery, the conversion of property, the breach of fiduciary duty, and the criminal referral for the notary, Noah Blake. I sat at my small dining table in the dark, watching the headlights of cars passing by on the All-American Expressway, and I felt a strange, quiet clarity. The Clark house was a ruin, and I was the one who was going to make sure the foundation was finally dug up and exposed to the light. The days following that confrontation in my apartment felt like a slow exhale, a period where the constant, high-frequency noise of the deployment was replaced by the quiet, methodical ticking of a legal clock I had finally set in motion. I spent a lot of time sitting on my small balcony near Fort Liberty, watching the North Carolina humidity settle over the longleaf pines, the air so thick and heavy you could almost taste the sap and the coming rain before the first drop ever hit the pavement. It was a strange, suspended animation, being back in a world that looked exactly the same as the one I had left 18 months ago, yet feeling like a complete stranger in my own skin, an officer in civilian clothes, trying to remember how to live without a manifest or a duty roster. I spent my mornings driving up to Raleigh to meet with Sophia Reed, sitting in an office that was all glass and polished steel, overlooking the green canopy of the City of Oaks, while we stripped away the screaming matches and the tears until all that was left were the forgery reports and the bank routing numbers. Sophia Reed had a way of laying out the evidence that made the betrayal look like a mathematical equation, a series of calculated risks taken by a man who had spent 30 years believing he could out-audit the truth. She showed me fragments of my sister's history that I'd been too busy to see clearly while I was moving through the ranks, revealing a pattern of failed boutiques in uptown Charlotte and catering businesses that never even made it to the licensing phase. My father had been the silent hand behind every collapse, using his position at the private wealth firm to shuffle funds and cover her tracks, treating her constant failures like operating losses in a portfolio he refused to let go of, because admitting she was failing would mean admitting he had lost control of his favorite investment. I sat in that office and realized that the Lake Norman house wasn't just a building to them. It was the liquidity they needed to keep the Clark family facade from cracking under the weight of my sister's entitlement and my father's pride. It's a strange thing to realize that you spent years trying to fit into a space that was never meant for you. And I think we all eventually hit that moment where we stop asking for a seat at the table and just decide to build our own. I remember standing by the window in that Raleigh high-rise, looking at the traffic on I-440 and thinking, I've spent my entire adult life learning how to protect people who don't even know my name. And the whole time, the people who shared my name were planning how to leave me with nothing. I kept thinking, they really thought I wouldn't come back. Or if I did, they thought the army would have made me too disciplined to make a scene in the suburbs. They mistook my oath of service for an oath of silence. A week later, I drove out to see Clara Vance, the woman who had lived 2 doors down from my grandmother for 22 years and knew the rhythm of that lakeside road better than anyone. She lived in a small weatherboard cottage that smelled of dried herbs, old books, and the kind of quiet history you only find in the South, a place where the clocks all seemed to have stopped in the late 90s. We sat on her screened-in porch, watching the dragonflies hover over the blue azaleas, and she talked to me about the version of my grandmother that my father and my sister had tried so hard to erase during the probate process. She told me how my grandmother, Evelyn Clark, used to sit on that private dock with a yellow legal pad, writing down notes about the scholarship she wanted to start for girls in our county, and how she'd once caught my father trying to look through her financial binders while she was in the kitchen making sweet tea. My grandmother had been a librarian. She knew that information was the only real currency, and she knew exactly what kind of man her son had become. A man who saw people as assets to be managed and liabilities to be mitigated. Clara was a mirror for me, showing me the life I could have had if I'd stayed in that town and played by the rules of the Clark hierarchy. A life of quiet compliance and country club luncheons where the truth was always tucked under a linen napkin. She had been the one who refused to get married just to satisfy the neighbors, the one who kept her own name and her own house when everyone else was trading theirs for a suburban dream they couldn't afford. She handed me an old photo album, a tactile record of the summers I'd spent at Lake Norman, and for the first time since I'd touched down at the airport, I felt the tension in my shoulders drop. I remembered the smell of the Buick's leather seats and the way the water felt against my skin, cold and honest. A world away from the burning trash and the sand of the Middle East. I realized then that my grandmother hadn't left me that house just to give me a financial head start. She'd left it to me because she knew I was the only one who wouldn't try to turn her memory into a marketing brand for a trendy restaurant. As the sun began to dip below the tree line, casting long, jagged shadows across the porch, Clara told me one more thing, a detail that Sophia Reed hadn't found in the public records. She said that in those final few months, my grandmother had started carrying a small leather notebook in her purse, a secret log where she wrote down every time my father visited and every time he brought up the deed to the lake house. She knew the predatory behavior was coming, and she had been building her own dossier in the silence of that lakeside kitchen, protecting her legacy with the same methodical precision I'd learned in logistics school. It made me realize that the strength I used to survive the desert didn't come from a military manual or a drill sergeant. It came from the woman who had stood her ground against a senior VP without ever raising her voice or losing her dignity. I sat in my car for a long time after leaving her house, looking at the sunflowers in the neighbors' yards, feeling the weight of the legacy I was finally reclaiming. That's what happens when you've spent your life being the one who solves problems and moves the cargo. You forget that you're allowed to be the one who needs justice, too. I drove back toward Fort Liberty with the windows down, the warm North Carolina air rushing past my face, and the radio silent because the thoughts in my head were finally starting to align. I wasn't just a daughter fighting a forgery anymore. And I wasn't just a soldier looking for a home. I was the authorized representative of a woman who had been betrayed by her own son. And I was going to make sure the Clark name stood for something more than just a stolen signature. The foundation of their lies was crumbling, and as I passed the signs for Fayetteville, I knew that when we finally stepped into that courtroom, my father wouldn't be facing a disobedient child. He'd be facing the consequences of every choice he'd ever made in the dark. The county courthouse in October smelled of hot asphalt and the damp, heavy scent of fallen oak leaves that gathered in the corners of the parking lot. I arrived 20 minutes early, standing in the hallway while the morning sun slanted through the high windows, hitting the brass buttons of my Class A dress uniform. Sophia Reed had been the one to suggest wearing it, telling me that the uniform reminded the court exactly who had been harmed while I was serving 6,000 miles away. I looked at the captain's bars glinting on my shoulders and the 82nd Airborne crest on my pocket, and for the first time in my life, the weight of the fabric didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a shield. Behind me, Major Liam Carter sat on a wooden bench, his presence a silent, stoic anchor of military support, while Clara Vance sat in the third row, clutching a small photo album like it was a piece of the lake itself. At 9:47 a.m., the heavy oak doors swung open, and the man I had spent my entire life trying to please walked in, followed by the rest of the Clark family. My father, Caleb Clark, was wearing one of his expensive charcoal suits and a deep red tie, his back straight and his jaw set with the same arrogant confidence he'd used to run wealth management meetings for decades. But as he scanned the room and his eyes landed on my uniform, something in his expression shifted. A brief flicker of recognition, or maybe just the realization that the daughter he'd dismissed was now a woman he couldn't control. My mother, Elise Clark, followed in a black dress, her eyes swollen and a tissue clutched in her hands, while my sister, Harper Clark, came last, looking less like a successful entrepreneur and more like a cornered animal. They sat at the far table with an attorney who looked like he specialized in minor traffic violations rather than felony fraud. A stark contrast to the surgical precision of Sophia Reed as she arranged her binders. Judge Patricia Whitmore entered the room with a voice that carried without effort. A woman who had spent 30 years on the bench and had no patience for the kind of suburban games my father liked to play. Sophia Reed stood up and didn't rush, opening her binder with a decisive click that echoed through the quiet courtroom as she laid out the evidence. She presented the forensic handwriting analysis that proved, with 99% certainty, that the signature on the power of attorney was a fake. And then she held up my military deployment orders, the ironclad proof that I was halfway across the globe on the day my father claimed I signed that paper in Charlotte. I sat there watching the man who taught me how to ride a bike stare at the table, his face turning a dull, ashen gray as his financial empire began to unravel in front of a public record. I kept waiting for him to look at me, to offer some kind of silent apology or even a look of defiance. But he just stared at the mahogany grain of the table. I remember thinking, I spent years wondering what I did wrong, wondering why I was never the favorite. And the answer was so simple. I was just the only one he couldn't own. The defense attorney tried to argue that my father was acting in the best interest of the family estate, that there was a verbal understanding, and that the Lake Norman house was always meant to stay in the Clark name. But Judge Whitmore cut through his excuses like a blade, asking if there was any written authorization from the property owner. And when the answer was no, she simply told him to continue. Then my father took the stand, straightening his tie and trying to maintain the facade of the respectable banker, claiming that my grandmother wasn't thinking clearly and that she was confused by the end. He spoke about her dementia as if it were a fact, but he couldn't produce a single medical record or a doctor's note to back it up. And I watched as the judge looked at him over her glasses with an expression of pure, unadulterated skepticism. Then it was Clara Vance's turn. She walked to the witness stand with the careful, deliberate steps of a woman who knew exactly why she was there, and her voice rang out through the room as she testified that my grandmother was the sharpest person she'd ever known. She told the court how she had driven my grandmother to the attorney's office to sign that will, and then she looked directly at my father and repeated the words my grandmother had said that day. That Caleb would try to take the house, and that's why it was only for me. The courtroom went so still, I could hear the rhythmic, thin sound of my mother's crying in the back row, a sound like a clock finally running down. Clara didn't stop there. She told the judge about the phone calls my father had intercepted for 2 years, about the dying woman who wondered why her granddaughter had forgotten her, and I saw my Aunt Janet press her hand to her mouth in the gallery. The weight of the betrayal was finally out in the open, no longer a family secret tucked away in a manicured suburb, but a documented crime being read into the record. Judge Whitmore took 15 minutes to review her notes, the silence in the room heavy enough to feel in my lungs as I sat there in my Class A's, looking at the American flag in the corner. Then she removed her glasses, set them on the bench, and looked at the man I used to call Dad with a gaze that was cold and unforgiving. She spoke about the systemic betrayal of an active duty service member and the calculated fraud that had been executed in my absence. She turned to me then, her expression softening just a fraction, and she asked if I wanted the court to move forward with the criminal referral to the district attorney for Class H felony forgery. She told me that if I said yes, there would be no going back, that my father would face an investigation that could lead to a prison sentence and the permanent loss of his reputation. Stop right here. If you were in her position, sign the papers and walk away to keep the peace, or push that button and let the law take its course. Yes or no below. I want to know. Okay, here's what I actually did. I stood up, the brass on my uniform catching the light, and I looked at the man who had stolen my name and my grandmother's peace. I thought about the phone calls she'd made that never reached me, and I thought about the smiley face emoji my sister had sent from a stolen restaurant. I looked at the judge and I said, "Yes, Your Honor. I want the truth on the record." The room seemed to exhale as the judge nodded once and began reading the final order. Full restitution of the $450,000 plus $85,000 in damages and legal fees, and a formal referral to the prosecutor's office. My father didn't move as the words hit him, but I watched his shoulders drop and his whole body sag into the chair. The king of the Clarks finally losing his throne in a small-town courtroom. He looked like a man who had suddenly aged 20 years, his expensive suit suddenly looking too big for a man who had lost his pride. As we rose for the judge to exit, I realized that the mission wasn't just about the money or the house anymore. It was about the fact that I was finally standing on my own 2 feet in a world that I had reclaimed one notarized document at a time. The hallway of the county courthouse felt longer than any tarmac I had ever marched across, the air suddenly still and smelling of floor wax, old wood, and the heavy scent of exhaustion as the morning crowd began to filter out toward the exits. I walked past my mother, Elise Clark, who stood by the water fountain with her head bowed and her hands trembling. The woman who had watched every spreadsheet entry and every forgery with a silence that had finally become its own kind of verdict. She didn't look at me as I passed, her role as a witness finally complete. Her life now a series of rented rooms and social apologies she would spend the next decade delivering to the Charlotte elite to explain why her husband was no longer at the club. I found Harper Clark near the double doors, her designer purse clutched so tight her knuckles were white, staring at the notices on the bulletin board as if she could find a way to rebrand the fact that her business was a crime scene. She didn't have a smiley face emoji for me this time, just a look of bewilderment that the sister she'd used as a convenient distraction for her culinary vanity project had finally stopped playing the part of the sacrificial lamb. I drove back toward Fort Liberty with the windows down, the warm North Carolina air smelling of pine resin and the coming rain. And I realized that for the first time in my life, the Clark family hierarchy had no power over me. I didn't go to the pot roast dinner, and I didn't answer the apologetic emails that started arriving from aunts and cousins who had spent the last year calling me ungrateful for not letting my father steal my inheritance. Instead, I took a portion of the restitution and quietly established the Evelyn Clark Memorial Scholarship at my old high school, a fund for students who were planning to serve their country just like I had. It wasn't about legacy or branding. It was about honoring the woman who taught me that the truth is the only thing worth defending, even if you have to do it alone. I spent that first weekend back at a small one-bedroom cabin near Jordan Lake, sitting on a screened porch and watching the herons hunt in the shallows, feeling the military discipline finally mesh with a personal peace I hadn't felt since I was a child on the private dock. The Lake Norman house was still there, but it wasn't mine anymore. The court had protected the Brennans, the retirees who had bought it in good faith. And I was okay with that, because I realized that the house was just wood and stone. The real inheritance was the clarity I felt as I looked at the stars over the water, knowing that I had survived the desert and the betrayal without losing the person my grandmother had raised me to be. I thought about the letters my mother had mailed me, the ones I kept in a drawer because I wasn't ready to open the door just yet. And I realized that boundaries are the only way to keep the wolves at bay. I wasn't the daughter who needed a seat at the table anymore. I was a major in the United States Army, and I had built my own table from the ground up, one that didn't require a forged signature to keep it standing. Before I tell you what happened to them, what does justice look like to you here? Drop it below. Then tell me, was what actually happened enough? What came next was something nobody expected, not even the lawyer. My father, Caleb Clark, was forced to resign from his position as senior VP at the private wealth firm within a month of the referral, his reputation in Charlotte evaporating as the notary, Noah Blake, lost his commercial license and provided a sworn statement detailing the fraud. My sister, Harper Clark, had to liquidate every commercial oven and white linen napkin from the stolen restaurant, moving into a 2-bedroom rental on the east side of town with our mother, while the Lake Norman property restitution slowly drained my father's retirement savings. The district attorney eventually accepted a plea deal that involved 5 years of probation and 1,000 hours of community service, ensuring that my father's name would forever be associated with a Class H felony rather than a balanced ledger. I think I kept forgiving them for so long because I needed to believe that the people who had known me my whole life couldn't really want to destroy me. That was my mistake, not theirs. I still drive past that lake sometimes, and I just keep going.